The siren was still screaming when Elena Voss walked through the sliding doors of Fairbridge General Hospital for the very first time. She had not even reached the front desk to sign her paperwork. She had not met her supervisor. She had not seen her locker, or learned where the break room was. All she had done was step inside the building, badge in hand, when the doors behind her burst open again, and 2 paramedics rushed in, pushing a stretcher. On the stretcher was a young man, pale and shaking, his arm bent at an angle that made 2 nearby visitors turn away. A woman ran beside the stretcher, screaming his name over and over. For a moment, everyone in the lobby froze. The receptionist fumbled for the phone. A young nurse near the coffee station dropped her cup. Even the security guard by the door seemed unsure what to do next. Elena did not freeze. She stepped forward, calm and certain, as if she had been walking through this exact hallway her whole life. "Move the stretcher to Bay 3, she said, her voice steady but firm. "Someone call the attending physician now. I need gloves." The paramedics blinked at her, confused. She was not wearing a hospital badge yet. She had not even filled out her forms. "Who are you?" one of them asked. "I am the new nurse," Elena said simply. "But right now, I am the only one moving. So let's move." Something in her tone made them obey without question. The stretcher rolled forward, and Elena walked beside it, her eyes scanning the young man from head to toe, in a way that seemed almost automatic, like she was reading a page she had read 1,000 times before. By the time they reached Bay 3, a nurse named Nora Bennett had come running, pulling on gloves as she moved. Nora had worked at Fairbridge for 11 years. She had seen new hires walk in nervous, new hires walk in overconfident, and new hires who fainted at the first sight of an open wound. She had never seen someone walk in during their first 5 minutes on the job and take charge of a trauma case like it was nothing. "Who called you in?" Nora asked, out of breath. "No one," Elena said. "I was just here." The young man on the stretcher groaned, his eyes fluttering. His name, according to the paramedics, was Marcus. He had been in a car accident 2 blocks from the hospital. His arm was broken, and there was a deep cut along his side that needed attention fast. Elena leaned down close to him. Her voice softened instantly, the sharp command from moments ago replaced with something warm and reassuring. "Marcus, I need you to look at me," she said. "You are safe now. You are going to be okay. I need you to breathe with me, slow and steady." Marcus's eyes found hers, and something about her voice seemed to calm him instantly. His breathing slowed. His shaking eased, just slightly. Nora stood beside her, stunned. She had trained dozens of new nurses. None of them spoke to frightened patients the way Elena did, like she had done this in far worse places than a quiet hospital in a small town. The attending physician, a tired-looking man named Owen Clark, arrived a moment later, pulling his coat off as he walked. He took one look at the scene, one look at Elena working with quick, practiced hands, and raised an eyebrow. "You're the new transfer," he said. It was not a question. "Elena Voss," she replied, not looking up from her work. "I have not finished my paperwork yet, but I did not think that mattered right now." Owen almost smiled. Almost. "No," he said, "it does not." Together, they worked to stabilize Marcus, cleaning the wound, checking his pulse, preparing him for further examination. Elena moved with a precision that made Owen pause more than once. She was not clumsy or hesitant like most new hires. She moved like someone who had done this every day for years, in places where mistakes were not an option. When Marcus was finally stable and wheeled off toward imaging, the small crowd in the emergency room let out a collective breath. The woman who had been screaming his name earlier, his sister, thanked Elena with tears streaming down her face. "You saved him," she said. "You were so calm. How were you so calm?" Elena only smiled gently. "He needed calm more than anything else," she said. "Panic does not fix broken bones." As the sister walked off to call her family, Nora pulled Elena aside, her curiosity impossible to hide any longer. "Okay," Nora said. "I have to ask, where did you work before this? Because that was not floor nurse work. That was trauma work. Real trauma work." Elena's smile faded just slightly, replaced by something quieter, something guarded. "I worked overseas," she said, "in medical support." "Overseas where?" "Different places," Elena said. "It does not matter now." I am here for a quiet job, a simple one. Nora studied her for a moment, sensing there was far more behind those calm eyes than Elena was willing to share. But she also sensed that pushing further would only make the new nurse retreat deeper into herself. So she let it go, at least for now. Well, Nora said instead, welcome to Fairbridge. Most people get a slower first day. I think I prefer this, Elena said. Slow days make me nervous. Nora laughed, but there was something behind Elena's joke that felt more true than funny. Later that afternoon, after her paperwork was finally signed and her badge was clipped to her scrubs, Elena was given a tour of the hospital by a friendly young man named Ethan Brooks, one of the newer resident doctors. Ethan talked fast and smiled often, clearly excited to have someone new to show around. This is the supply closet, this is radiology, and this, he said, opening a door to a small break room, is where we all pretend to relax for 10 minutes before the next emergency happens. Elena smiled politely, though her eyes kept drifting toward the emergency room doors, as if some part of her was always listening for the next siren. You handled that car accident really well, Ethan said, glancing at her sideways. Most people freeze during their first real trauma case. You didn't even blink. I have seen worse, Elena said quietly, before catching herself. I mean, I have trained for situations like that. It becomes automatic after a while. Ethan raised an eyebrow but did not push. Still, the words stayed with him, tucked away in the back of his mind, the way small mysterious clues often do before they matter. As the tour continued, Elena passed a bulletin board near the nurses' station, covered with photographs of hospital events, award ceremonies, and community outreach days. One photo, slightly faded, showed a group of soldiers standing beside a makeshift medical tent, dust and heat visible even in the still image. Elena paused for just a second longer than necessary, her eyes lingering on the photograph before she forced herself to look away. Ethan noticed but said nothing. By the end of her first shift, word had already spread through the hospital about the new nurse who had jumped into action before she even had her badge. Some staff found it impressive, others found it strange. A few, like the hospital administrator Grace Whitfield, found it worth a closer look. Grace sat in her office that evening, scrolling through Elena's personnel file on her computer screen. Most of it looked ordinary. Certifications, a nursing license, glowing recommendation letters. But there were gaps, long stretches of blank space where employment history should have been, dates that did not quite add up, a few lines marked simply as classified assignment, with no further explanation. Grace leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk. Who exactly did we hire? She murmured to herself. She thought about calling Elena into her office the next morning to ask directly. But something about the quiet confidence in Elena's eyes, the calm control she had shown with Marcus, made Grace hesitate. Whatever Elena Voss was hiding, it clearly was not something dangerous. If anything, it looked like something that had once meant the difference between life and death for other people. Grace closed the file and decided to wait. Whatever secrets Elena carried, they would surface eventually. Secrets like that always did. That night, after her shift ended, Elena sat alone in her car in the hospital parking lot, staring at the steering wheel without starting the engine. Her hands were steady, the same steady hands that had worked so calmly over Marcus a few hours earlier. But now, in the silence, a small tremor ran through her fingers, one she quickly pressed flat against her legs. She thought about the sound of the siren from earlier, how it had cut through her like a familiar signal, a sound she used to hear almost every single day of her life not too long ago. Back then, the sirens meant something different. They meant helicopters. They meant urgency measured in seconds, not minutes. They meant faces far younger than they should have been, looking up at her with the same fear she had seen in Marcus's eyes that afternoon. She had told herself, when she took this job, that she wanted something quiet, something simple, a place where the stakes were smaller, where she could help without carrying the full weight of every decision on her shoulders alone, a place to breathe. But standing in that emergency room today, moving without thinking, guiding a frightened young man through his fear, she had felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not fear, not dread, something closer to purpose. She shook her head, started the car, and told herself it was nothing. just muscle memory, just an old habit refusing to fade quietly into the background of an ordinary life. The next morning, Elena arrived early, long before her shift officially started. She walked the hallways slowly, learning the layout in the quiet hours before the hospital came fully alive. She noted where the crash carts were kept, where the trauma bays were located, how far the elevator was from the emergency entrance. It was a habit she could not seem to break, memorizing exits and equipment wherever she went, as if some part of her was always preparing for the next emergency before it arrived. Nora found her standing near the supply room, quietly counting boxes of gauze. "You do not have to do inventory," Nora said, smiling. "That is not really a first-week task." "Old habit," Elena said. "I like knowing where everything is before I need it." Most people learn that after their first year here, not their first day. Elena only shrugged, offering no further explanation, and Nora, sensing the same quiet wall she had noticed the day before, did not press. As the days passed, Elena settled into a rhythm at Fairbridge General. She learned the names of her co-workers, memorized the routines of the emergency room, and slowly began to feel less like a stranger and more like part of the team. Patients responded well to her calm nature. Co-workers respected her steady hands, yet there remained a quiet distance around her, an invisible boundary that no one quite knew how to cross. Meanwhile, across town, a former Marine named Jake Reyes sat in his small apartment, rubbing a dull ache in his side that had been bothering him for weeks. He had an appointment scheduled at Fairbridge General for the following week, a routine follow-up related to an old injury from his years of service. His doctor had assured him it was nothing serious, just a checkup to be safe. Jake had no idea that his next visit to that hospital would change everything, not just for him, but for the quiet new nurse who had already caught the attention of everyone around her. For now, he simply pressed a hand against his side, took a slow breath, and told himself it was nothing. He was wrong. And somewhere across town, without knowing it yet, Elena Voss was about to meet the one patient whose case would finally force her past out of the shadows and into the light. The chair scraped hard against the floor as Jake Reyes stood up too fast, his hand flying to his side, his face suddenly drained of color. "Jake?" the receptionist called out, half rising from her seat. "Are you all right?" He did not answer. His knees buckled, and he grabbed the edge of the check-in counter just before he would have collapsed onto the waiting room floor. A folder of papers slipped from his other hand and scattered across the tiles. It had only been a routine follow-up appointment. 10 minutes, the scheduler had told him. A quick check on an old injury from his years overseas. Nothing that should have required more than a glance and a signature. He had walked in feeling only mildly uncomfortable, the same dull ache in his side that had bothered him for weeks. He had not expected the sudden sharp pain that now tore through him like something had torn open on the inside. "Someone get help," the receptionist shouted, already reaching for the phone. "Now, please." A young man nearby rushed to steady Jake, wrapping an arm under his shoulder, as Jake's legs gave out completely. Jake's skin had turned pale, almost gray, sweat breaking out across his forehead despite the cool air of the waiting room. "I am fine," Jake managed to whisper, though the words came out shaky and unconvincing. "Just need a minute." He did not have a minute. Down the hallway, in the middle of updating a patient chart, Elena heard the commotion before she understood what was happening. The receptionist's voice, sharp with panic, cut through the low hum of the waiting room noise. Elena's head lifted instantly, her body already moving before her mind had finished processing the sound. She rounded the corner just as Jake slid the rest of the way to the floor, his body suddenly limp, his breathing shallow and fast. "Move back," Elena said, her voice cutting through the rising panic of onlookers gathering nearby. "Everyone move back and give him room." She dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers instantly finding his wrist, checking his pulse, her eyes scanning his face, his color, the way his chest rose and fell. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, leaning close. "Tell me your name." Jake's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Jake," he managed. "Jake Reyes." "Jake, I need you to stay with me," Elena said. "I need you to keep talking to me. Where does it hurt?" "My side," he gasped. It just tore. It felt like something tore. Elena's hands moved quickly, lifting the edge of his shirt just enough to check the area he pointed to. What she found made her jaw tighten, though her voice remained perfectly calm. There was swelling along his side, a deep discoloration spreading beneath the skin, a sign of something happening internally that no ordinary follow-up appointment should have missed. "Ethan," she called out, spotting the young resident hurrying toward them from down the hall. "I need a stretcher here immediately. And get Dr. Clark. Tell him it is urgent." Ethan froze for half a second at the sight of Jake on the floor, his training momentarily overwhelmed by the suddenness of the situation. Then he snapped into motion, sprinting toward the nurse's station shouting for a stretcher. "Where is Dr. Clark?" Nora's voice rang out moments later as she rushed toward them, having heard the commotion from the other end of the hallway. "He is handling another emergency in Bay 2, Ethan called back breathlessly. "He said 5 minutes, maybe less." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. 5 minutes was a long time when someone's body was quietly failing beneath the surface. "We do not have 5 minutes to wait and do nothing," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Nora, help me get him onto the stretcher the moment it arrives. Gently, keep his spine straight." The stretcher rolled up seconds later, pushed by a nervous young orderly, who looked barely old enough to be working there. Together, Elena and Nora carefully shifted Jake onto it, his body trembling, his breathing growing more labored with every passing second. "Talk to me, Jake," Elena said as they wheeled him quickly toward the nearest trauma bay. "Tell me about the injury. When did this start?" "Years ago," Jake gasped, his words coming out in short bursts. "Overseas. Old wound. They told me it healed, said it was fine." "Sometimes old wounds do not heal the way we think they do," Elena murmured, almost to herself, her hands working quickly to check his blood pressure as they moved. The numbers on the monitor made her stomach tighten, though her face betrayed nothing. "His blood pressure is dropping fast," she said sharply. "Nora, I need fluids running now. Ethan, where is Dr. Clark?" "Still tied up," Ethan said, his voice tight with worry. "He said he is coming as soon as he can stabilize the other patient." Elena's mind raced, though her hands remained steady, moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed Jake's condition. The swelling along his side, the dropping blood pressure, the pale color of his skin, all of it painted a picture she recognized immediately. A picture from a different life entirely. A life filled with far worse conditions than a quiet hospital hallway. Internal bleeding. Jake had been living for years with an old, poorly healed injury, likely from some kind of past trauma sustained during his time in service. Whatever had caused it originally, something inside had finally given way, and now his body was quietly losing the fight beneath a surface that looked deceptively calm. "We cannot wait for Dr. Clark," Elena said, more to herself than to the room. "Every minute we wait, he loses more ground." She looked at Jake's face, now slick with sweat, his eyes struggling to stay open, fear flickering behind the pain. "Jake," she said gently, leaning close so he could hear her clearly despite his fading focus. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" His eyes found hers, and despite everything, despite the fear and the pain and the confusion of a routine appointment turning into a fight for his life, something about her voice steadied him just enough to nod. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." Elena turned to Nora, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the chaos of the room with absolute authority. "Get me a suture kit, gauze, and clamps, now. And someone page anesthesiology. Tell them we may need them fast." Nora blinked, startled by the sudden shift in Elena's tone, but did not hesitate. She turned and sprinted toward the supply closet without a single question. Ethan lingered near the doorway, unsure whether to follow Elena's instructions or wait for the attending physician, torn between protocol and the urgency unfolding in front of him. "Ethan," Elena said firmly, without looking up from Jake, "I need another set of hands. Are you with me or not?" Something in her voice, calm yet undeniably commanding, made the decision for him. He stepped forward, pulling on gloves as he moved. "I am with you," he said. Jake's monitor beeped steadily, though the rhythm had grown faster, more urgent, a silent alarm building beneath the surface of the room. Elena worked quickly, her hands moving with a precision that seemed to belong to someone who had done this 1,000 times before, in places where the stakes were measured not in hours or minutes, but in seconds. Outside the trauma bay, a small crowd of hospital staff had begun to gather, drawn by the tension radiating from the room, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding just beyond the curtain. Nora returned moments later with the supplies Elena had requested, her hands trembling slightly as she set them down on the tray beside the bed. "Dr. Clark is almost done," Nora said. "He said 2 more minutes." "We may not have 2 minutes," Elena replied quietly, her eyes fixed on the monitor tracking Jake's vital signs. The room fell into a tense, focused silence, broken only by the steady beeping of machines and the low murmur of Elena's voice, as she continued speaking softly to Jake, keeping him anchored, keeping him present, refusing to let panic take hold of either of them. "You are doing great, Jake," she said. "Just keep breathing with me, slow and steady, just like before." Jake's eyes remained fixed on hers, finding a strange comfort in the calm certainty radiating from her voice, even as his body continued its silent struggle beneath the surface. The monitor gave a sudden, sharp beep, different from the steady rhythm before, and Elena's eyes snapped toward it instantly. "His pressure just dropped again," she said, her voice tightening only slightly. "Ethan, hang another bag of fluids, wide open. Nora, I need you to help me turn him just slightly. I want to check the other side of the wound." Jake groaned as they shifted him, his hand gripping the edge of the stretcher tightly, his knuckles pale. "I know it hurts," Elena said softly, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "I know. Just a few more seconds, and then we will let you rest again." Ethan hung the new bag of fluids, his hands moving faster now, more confident than they had been just minutes earlier. Something about Elena's steady presence seemed to calm the entire room, spreading outward like ripples on still water, settling even the most anxious hands among them. Nora, standing at Jake's side, glanced up at Elena with something between awe and disbelief. "How do you know exactly what to check?" she whispered, careful not to distract from the work at hand. "This is not something they teach in a regular training program." Elena did not answer right away, her focus entirely on the wound in front of her, her fingers gently probing the swollen skin with careful precision. "I have seen this pattern before," she finally said, her voice quiet but certain. "More times than I would like to remember." Nora wanted to ask more, but the urgency of the moment left no room for further questions. Jake's breathing had grown shallow again, his eyelids fluttering as exhaustion and pain pulled him toward unconsciousness. "Jake, stay with me," Elena said firmly, her hand gently pressing against his cheek to keep him alert. "I need your eyes open just a little longer. Can you do that for me?" Jake's eyes opened slightly, unfocused but present, fixed on the calm certainty in her face. "You remind me," he mumbled weakly, "of someone I used to know, a long time ago, far from here." Elena's hands paused for just a fraction of a second, something flickering behind her steady expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Save your strength," she said gently, her voice betraying nothing. "Tell me about her later, when you are feeling stronger." Jake managed a faint, weak smile before his eyes drifted closed again, though his breathing remained steady beneath Elena's careful watch. Outside the trauma bay, the small crowd of onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the tension radiating from behind the curtain, whispers passing quickly from one person to the next. Word had already begun to spread through the hospital that something unusual was happening in Bay 3, that the new nurse who had impressed everyone on her first day was now standing at the center of a crisis far beyond her stated job title. Grace Whitfield, alerted by a call from the front desk, hurried down the hallway just in time to see the gathered crowd outside the trauma bay. She pushed through gently, her eyes catching sight of Elena through the gap in the curtain, moving with the same calm authority she had shown days earlier with Marcus. Grace's mind flashed back to the redacted file sitting on her office computer, the blank spaces where employment history should have been, the vague mention of classified assignments. Watching Elena now, working with such unshaken precision over a patient whose condition had clearly caught even the hospital's own doctor off guard, Grace felt a growing certainty that whatever secrets Elena carried were about to surface, whether she was ready or not. Beside her, Ethan stood watching the same scene, his mind quietly working through something that had been nagging at him since the moment Elena stepped forward without hesitation. The way she had checked Jake's pulse, the order in which she had assessed his injuries, the specific way she had positioned her hands along his side. All of it matched something Ethan had seen only once before, during a training seminar led by a former military doctor who had shown recordings of field treatment under extreme pressure. At the time, Ethan had found the seminar interesting but distant, a glimpse into a world far removed from his quiet daily work at Fairbridge General. Watching Elena now, he felt an uncomfortable chill settle over him, the growing realization that the calm, steady nurse beside him was not simply skilled. She was trained for conditions none of them had ever faced, conditions where the margin for error did not exist at all. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again, deciding the middle of a crisis was not the moment to ask the questions building steadily in his mind. There would be time for that later. Right now, Jake needed every ounce of focus the room could offer. The monitor beeped again, steady this time, a small but meaningful sign that the fluids and careful positioning had bought them precious time. Elena allowed herself the smallest breath of relief, though her hands never stopped moving, never stopped checking, never stopped preparing for whatever came next. "Good," she murmured, mostly to herself. "Good. Hold on just a little longer, Jake." The curtain rustled behind her, and though she did not turn immediately, some instinct told her that the room had just gained another presence, one who would recognize, faster than anyone else standing there, exactly what kind of skill they were witnessing. Somewhere behind them, unnoticed in the urgency of the moment, Dr. Owen Clark finally pushed through the door of the trauma bay, still pulling off gloves from his previous patient, ready to take charge of whatever emergency awaited him. What he saw instead stopped him cold in the doorway. There, standing over Jake Reyes with complete control and unshaken focus, was Elena, working exactly like a trauma surgeon rather than a newly hired nurse 3 days into her job. And for the first time since she had arrived at Fairbridge General, the calm, quiet mystery surrounding Elena Voss was about to break wide open. "What do we have?" Owen asked, stepping forward quickly, his eyes scanning Jake's vitals on the monitor, before landing on Elena's hands, still working steadily over the wound. "Male, mid-30s, former service member," Elena said, her voice clipped and efficient, giving him exactly the information he needed without wasted words. "Old injury, likely from an earlier trauma, poorly healed and now reopened internally. Blood pressure dropped twice in the last 10 minutes. Fluids running, but he needs more than fluids. He needs surgical attention, and soon." Owen's eyes moved quickly from the monitor to the wound, then back to Elena, an unmistakable flicker of surprise crossing his face, as he took in the accuracy and speed of her assessment. "That is a very specific read for someone who has been here 3 days, he said, though there was no accusation in his voice, only genuine curiosity. "I have seen this exact pattern before," Elena replied simply, "more times than I would like to count." Owen studied her for a long moment, then nodded, deciding the details of her past could wait. Right now, a man's life was balanced on a thin, fragile edge, and every second mattered more than any question. "Talk me through what you have done so far," he said, pulling on fresh gloves as he moved closer to the bed. Elena walked him through it quickly and clearly, describing the fluids, the positioning, the signs she had monitored, the pattern of Jake's pulse and blood pressure over the last several minutes. Owen listened carefully, nodding along, occasionally asking a sharp, precise question that Elena answered instantly, without hesitation. "We need to get him to surgery," Owen said finally, "but the surgical team is tied up with another emergency 2 floors up. It will be at least 15 minutes before anyone can get down here." "He does not have 15 minutes, Elena said quietly, her eyes fixed on the monitor as Jake's numbers dipped again. Owen's jaw tightened. "Then we stabilize him here, as much as we possibly can, and buy him the time he needs." Elena nodded once, already moving before he finished speaking. "I need a wider suture kit, and someone needs to hold pressure exactly where I show them. Ethan, come here." Ethan stepped forward immediately, his earlier hesitation replaced now with focused determination. Elena guided his hands gently but firmly to the correct position along Jake's side, showing him exactly how much pressure to apply and where. "Just like that," she said. "Steady, not too hard. You are doing great." Ethan nodded, his hands trembling only slightly as he held the position exactly as instructed, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe, at how naturally Elena moved through each step of the process. Owen worked alongside Elena now, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm, despite having never worked together before. Nora assisted from the other side, her earlier nervousness replaced with steady focus as she followed each instruction Elena gave with quiet precision. "His pulse is weakening," Owen said, glancing at the monitor with growing concern. "We need to move faster." Elena's hands moved with practiced speed, working to control the internal bleeding as best as the situation allowed, using techniques that seemed almost instinctive, her fingers finding exactly the right points of pressure without hesitation or uncertainty. "Where did you learn to do that?" Owen asked quietly, watching her work with growing amazement. "That specific technique I have only seen described in field manuals used by military surgical teams." Elena did not look up, her focus entirely on Jake, on the steady rhythm of keeping him stable, keeping him alive. "I learned it somewhere far from here," she said simply. "A long time ago, in a place where we did not always have the luxury of proper equipment or enough time." Owen wanted to ask more, but the urgency of the moment pulled his focus back to the numbers on the monitor, back to the fragile life balanced in front of them. Jake stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open just enough to see the small crowd working over him, their faces a blur of focused determination. "Am I going to be okay?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the beeping of the monitors. Elena leaned close, her voice steady and warm despite the tension gripping the room. "You are going to be okay, Jake. I promise you that. Just keep breathing with me." Something in her voice reached him, even through the haze of pain and exhaustion, and his breathing slowly began to steady, matching the calm rhythm she offered him. Outside the trauma bay, Jake's emergency contact, a woman named Claire Bennett, arrived at the hospital after receiving a hurried phone call from the front desk. She had been listed as his neighbor and closest friend, since he had no immediate family living nearby. She rushed through the sliding doors, her face tight with worry, searching desperately for anyone who could tell her what was happening. "I got a call about Jake Reyes," she said breathlessly to the receptionist. "Is he all right? What happened?" "He is being treated right now," the receptionist said gently, guiding her toward the waiting area. "The team is doing everything they can. Someone will update you as soon as possible." Claire sat down heavily in one of the waiting room chairs, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She had known Jake for years, long enough to understand the quiet weight he carried from his time in service, the old injuries he rarely spoke about, the nights she sometimes heard him pacing his apartment when sleep would not come. She had always worried that his old wounds, the ones beneath the surface, would eventually demand attention he could not avoid. She glanced toward the hallway leading to the trauma bay, praying quietly that whatever was happening behind those doors would end with good news. Back inside the trauma bay, Elena continued working with steady focus, unaware of the woman waiting anxiously just beyond the walls, unaware that Jake's recovery mattered to more people than the hospital staff working over him. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, the room filled with the quiet sounds of focused work, the steady beeping of monitors, and the low murmur of Elena's voice keeping Jake anchored to consciousness. As her hands continued their steady work, a memory rose unbidden in the back of Elena's mind, distant yet strangely close, the way old memories often feel when the present moment mirrors them so closely. She remembered a tent lit by a single lantern, the air thick with heat, a young soldier not much older than Jake, lying on a makeshift table, while she worked with far fewer supplies than she had here. She remembered the sound of her own voice back then, steady even when her hands trembled with exhaustion, guiding frightened young men and women through the worst moments of their lives, with nothing but calm words and careful hands. She had promised herself she would never have to summon that version of herself again. Yet here she was, in a quiet hospital in a quiet town, doing exactly what she had once sworn to leave behind. She pushed the memory aside gently, the way she had learned to do so many times before, and returned her full focus to Jake, to the steady rhythm of his breathing, to the numbers on the monitor that mattered more than any memory ever could. "You are doing so well, Jake," she murmured. "Just a little longer now." Nora watched from the other side of the bed, her earlier fear slowly transforming into something closer to quiet admiration. She had trained under skilled doctors before, had watched steady hands perform difficult procedures under pressure, but never had she seen someone move with such complete, unshaken certainty, as though every motion had already been rehearsed 1,000 times in some other life. "How is she so calm?" Nora whispered to Ethan, who stood holding pressure exactly as instructed, his own hands finally steadying under the quiet confidence radiating from Elena beside him. "I do not think this is her first emergency like this," Ethan whispered back. "I think this might be closer to normal for her than anything we do here." Owen, overhearing the exchange, said nothing, but the thoughtful expression on his face suggested he was beginning to reach the very same conclusion. Slowly, gradually, the numbers on the monitor began to stabilize. Jake's blood pressure, which had been dropping dangerously low, began to climb back toward a safer range. His pulse steadied. The pale gray color of his skin began to shift back toward something closer to normal. Owen let out a slow breath, glancing at Elena with an expression that mixed relief with unmistakable respect. "You just bought him the time he needed," Owen said quietly. "That was not floor nurse work. That was trauma surgery." Elena finally allowed herself a small breath of relief, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the immediate danger passed. "He is stable enough to move now," she said, "but he still needs proper surgical repair as soon as possible. This bought him time, nothing more." Owen nodded, already reaching for his radio to call ahead to the surgical team, updating them on Jake's condition and the urgency of his transfer. As the team prepared Jake for the move, Owen lingered a moment longer beside Elena, studying her with an expression that mixed professional respect with quiet fascination. "I have worked alongside a lot of nurses over the years," he said, keeping his voice low enough that only Elena could hear. "I have worked alongside a fair number of surgeons too. What you just did in there was not something you pick up from a textbook, and it was not something you pick up from a standard nursing program either. That was earned, the hard way." Elena kept her eyes on Jake as the orderlies carefully positioned the stretcher for transfer, her expression giving little away. "Some things are earned in places most people never have to see," she said quietly. "I am grateful every day that Jake will get to walk away from this and go back to an ordinary life. That is worth more than anything I had to learn to make it happen." Owen studied her for a long moment, sensing there was far more behind her calm words than she was willing to share so soon. He decided not to press further, at least not yet, recognizing the same quiet resistance Nora had noticed on Elena's very first day. "Whatever your story is," Owen said finally, "thank you. He would not have made it another 10 minutes without what you did in there." Elena allowed herself a small nod, though the weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. She had spent years trying to leave behind the identity of someone who held lives in her hands under impossible conditions, choosing instead a quieter role, where the stakes felt smaller, safer, easier to carry. Yet here, in this ordinary hospital, in this ordinary town, that same skill had once again made the difference between life and loss. She was not sure yet whether to feel proud of that, or afraid of what it meant for the quiet life she had tried so carefully to build. Word of what had happened in Bay 3 moved through Fairbridge General faster than any announcement over the hospital speakers ever could. By the time Jake had been stabilized enough to prepare for transfer, small groups of staff members stood clustered near the nurses' station, in the hallway outside radiology, even near the vending machines by the staff entrance, all trading versions of the same story. "I heard she saved him before the surgical team even got there," one nurse whispered to another near the coffee station. "I heard she used to work in a war zone," someone else murmured. "That is why she moved like that. No hesitation at all." "She has only been here 3 days," a third voice added, disbelief evident in every word. 3 days, and she has already handled 2 emergencies most of us would need backup for." The rumors grew and shifted as they spread, each version slightly different from the last, yet all circling the same undeniable truth. Whoever Elena Voss truly was, whatever life she had lived before walking through the doors of Fairbridge General, it was clearly far removed from the quiet, simple existence she had claimed to want. Grace overheard fragments of the conversation as she made her way back toward the trauma bay, her earlier curiosity now fully replaced with quiet determination. Whatever answers Elena had been holding back, it was time they came into the open, not out of suspicion, but out of a genuine need to understand the woman who had already proven, twice now, that she was far more capable than her modest job title suggested. As the immediate crisis eased, the small crowd gathered outside the trauma bay began to disperse, whispers passing quickly from person to person about what they had just witnessed. Nora stepped back from the bed, pulling off her gloves with hands that were still slightly unsteady from the tension of the last several minutes. "I have worked here for 11 years, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "I have never seen anything like that." Ethan, still holding his position beside Jake's bed, glanced up at Elena with wide eyes, the earlier flicker of recognition now fully formed into certainty. "That technique you used," he said slowly, "I have only seen it in training footage, military footage, forward surgical teams, working in the field, under fire, with almost nothing but their hands and basic supplies." Elena's eyes met his, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. The quiet mystery that had surrounded her since her very first day at Fairbridge General now hung heavy in the air, impossible to ignore any longer. "You are not wrong," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Grace, who had remained near the doorway throughout the entire ordeal, stepped forward now, her earlier curiosity replaced with something closer to quiet understanding. "Elena," she said gently, "I think it is time we talked, properly this time." Elena nodded slowly, glancing once more at Jake, now resting more peacefully, as the surgical team arrived to prepare him for transfer. Whatever she had been running from, whatever quiet life she had hoped to build behind the walls of a small hospital far from the chaos of her past, it seemed the truth was no longer willing to stay hidden. As the surgical team wheeled Jake away toward the operating room, Elena took a slow breath, steadying herself for the conversation she now knew was unavoidable. "All right," she said quietly, "let's talk." But before Grace could respond, a voice called out from down the hallway, familiar in a way that made Elena's entire body go still. "Voss, is that really you?" Elena turned slowly toward the voice, her eyes widening as she recognized the face of a man she had not seen in years, a man whose presence instantly confirmed every unspoken suspicion swirling through the hospital that day. Standing there, still dressed in surgical scrubs from the emergency he had just handled 2 floors up, was a face from a past Elena had tried so carefully to leave behind. Dr. Daniel Ashford stood frozen at the end of the hallway, a clipboard hanging loosely from his hand, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet joy. It had been almost 5 years since he had last seen Elena Voss, and yet he recognized her instantly. The same steady posture, the same calm eyes, the same quiet strength that had once made her one of the most respected combat surgeons he had ever served alongside. "Daniel," Elena said softly, her voice catching slightly on his name, "I did not know you were working here." "I transferred in about a year ago," he said, closing the distance between them with slow, careful steps, as though approaching a memory too fragile to disturb. "I never expected to see you again, especially not here of all places." Grace and Owen exchanged a glance, both sensing that whatever conversation was about to unfold held answers far beyond anything Elena's personnel file could explain. "You two know each other?" Owen asked carefully. Daniel let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "Know each other does not quite cover it," he said. "Elena and I served together for almost 3 years on a forward surgical team overseas. She was, without question, one of the most skilled trauma surgeons I have ever worked beside. We treated soldiers in conditions most people could not imagine, often with barely enough equipment and never enough time." The hallway fell into stunned silence. Nora, who had followed at a respectful distance, felt her earlier suspicions solidify into something undeniable. Ethan simply stared, his mind connecting every piece of the puzzle that had been forming since Elena's very first day. "A surgeon," Grace repeated slowly, looking at Elena with an expression that held no judgment, only quiet astonishment. "You are a combat surgeon." Elena's shoulders tensed slightly, the weight of the truth finally settling into the open air after weeks, months, years of careful silence. "I was," she said quietly. "A long time ago. It feels like now." "It was not that long ago," Daniel said gently. 2 years, Elena. That is not a lifetime." "It feels like one," she murmured. Daniel studied her closely, his earlier joy softening into something more careful, more concerned. "What happened to you?" he asked. "One day you were the steadiest hands on our entire team, the surgeon everyone wanted beside them during the worst moments. Then you were gone. No message, no explanation, just gone." Elena glanced toward the trauma bay where Jake had been stabilized, then back toward the small group gathered around her, each face reflecting a mixture of curiosity, respect, and quiet concern. "Maybe we should not have this conversation in the middle of the hallway," she said softly. Grace nodded immediately, gesturing toward a quiet office nearby. "My office," she said, "whenever you are ready." A short while later, Elena sat across from Grace, with Daniel standing nearby, unable to fully step away from the conversation, now that the past he thought he understood had resurfaced so unexpectedly. Owen had returned to check on Jake, leaving the deeper conversation to unfold without him, though his mind remained lingering on everything he had witnessed. Elena wrapped her hands around a cup of water Grace had offered her, staring at it for a long moment before finally speaking. "I served for almost 6 years," she began quietly. "Most of it overseas, attached to forward surgical teams that moved wherever the fighting was heaviest. We worked in tents, sometimes in buildings that were barely standing, treating young men and women who had been through more than anyone their age should ever have to face." Grace listened without interrupting, her earlier curiosity now replaced with quiet, careful attention. "I was good at it," Elena continued. "Better than good, if I am being honest. I could work faster under pressure than almost anyone else on my team. I could stay calm when everything around me was chaos. For years, that made me proud. It made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup in her hands. "Then one night, we lost someone we should not have lost," she said quietly. "A young soldier, barely older than some of the patients I have treated here in just the last few days. We did everything right, every step, every decision, exactly as it should have been, and it still was not enough." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling heavily over everyone present. "After that night," Elena continued, "something inside me changed. I kept working, kept showing up, kept doing the job everyone believed I was born to do. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Every time a new patient came through, I waited for the moment it would happen again, the moment my hands would not be enough, no matter how skilled they were." Daniel stepped closer, his earlier confusion softening into quiet understanding. "You never told any of us," he said gently. "You just disappeared one day." "I could not face any of you," Elena admitted. "I could not face the thought of losing someone else while everyone believed I was the steadiest person on the team, so I left. I told myself I needed something quieter, something simpler, a place where I could still help people, but without carrying the full weight of every decision alone." "So you became a nurse," Grace said softly. "I became a nurse," Elena confirmed. "I told myself it was enough, that helping in smaller ways was enough to make peace with everything I walked away from." Daniel studied her closely, his voice quiet but firm. "And has it been enough?" Elena hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the window, toward the hallway beyond it that led back toward the trauma bay, where Jake still rested, stable now, thanks to hands that clearly had not forgotten a single lesson from her years overseas. "I thought it was," she said finally. "Until today." The office fell quiet again, each person processing the weight of everything Elena had just shared. Grace, ever practical despite the emotional depth of the conversation, finally spoke. "For what it is worth," she said gently, "nothing you just told me changes how impressed I am by what you did today. If anything, it explains it. You saved a man's life today, Elena. Twice now, in less than a week." "I did what anyone with the right training would have done," Elena said quietly. "No," Daniel said firmly. "You did what only a handful of people in the world could have done, under that kind of pressure, without a moment of hesitation. That is not something everyone can carry. That is not something everyone can walk away from and still summon again when it matters most." Elena looked up at him, something vulnerable flickering behind her usually steady expression. "I did not want to need it again," she said softly. "I did not want to prove that it was still there. And yet," Daniel said gently, "it was. Exactly when someone needed it most." Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice warm but careful. Elena, I am not going to pretend I fully understand everything you have been through, but I have run this hospital long enough to know the difference between someone who is broken and someone who is simply carrying more than they have had the chance to set down. You are not the first person to walk through these doors hiding a heavier past than anyone realized. You will probably not be the last. Elena managed a small, tired smile, the first genuine one anyone had seen from her since her very first day at Fairbridge General. Thank you, she said quietly, for listening, for not treating this like something to fear. Why would I fear the person who just saved 2 lives in 1 week? Grace asked gently. A soft knock interrupted the moment, and Ethan poked his head into the office, his expression a careful mixture of hesitation and excitement. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but Jake is out of surgery. The surgical team said the repair went well. He is expected to make a full recovery. The tension in the room broke instantly, replaced by quiet relief. Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the news settle fully before opening them again, meeting Ethan's gaze with quiet gratitude. Thank you for telling us, she said. He has actually been asking for you, Ethan added. Once he woke up from the sedation, one of the first things he asked was whether the nurse who stayed with him was all right. Something in Elena's chest tightened at those words, a quiet warmth spreading through the careful walls she had built around herself for so long. I should go see him, she said softly. Daniel nodded, stepping back slightly to give her room. Go, he said. We can talk more later, whenever you are ready. There is no rush now. Elena rose from her chair, offering Grace a small, grateful nod before making her way out of the office and down the hallway toward Jake's recovery room, carrying with her a truth that no longer needed to hide in the shadows of redacted files and quiet deflections. Jake's recovery room was quiet when Elena arrived, sunlight filtering gently through the half-closed blinds. He looked pale still, tired from the surgery, but his eyes brightened the moment he saw her step through the doorway. There she is, he said weakly, a tired smile spreading across his face. The nurse who apparently used to be a lot more than a nurse. Elena laughed softly, pulling a chair closer to his bedside. Word travels fast around here. Small hospital, Jake said. Big story. I heard pieces of it from one of the surgical residents. Combat surgeon, forward teams, the whole thing. Elena's smile faded slightly, though it did not disappear entirely. I suppose there is no keeping secrets in a place like this. For what it is worth, Jake said, his voice growing steadier as the conversation continued. I am glad it came out. Whatever training gave you those hands, it is the reason I am still here to complain about hospital food. Elena reached over and gently adjusted the blanket near his shoulder, a small, caring gesture that felt more natural to her than almost anything else in her new civilian life. You gave us quite a scare, she said. That old injury of yours has been waiting a long time to make itself known. Story of my life, Jake said with a tired chuckle. Old wounds have a funny way of catching up eventually. Something in his words settled quietly over Elena, a truth she recognized far too well in her own life. They do, she agreed softly. More often than we would like. Jake studied her for a moment, his expression turning more serious despite the exhaustion still weighing on him. Can I ask you something? Of course. Back there, when everything was falling apart, you told me to trust you. And I did. Completely. Without even really knowing why. How did you do that? How did you make a total stranger feel that safe in the middle of something so terrifying? Elena considered the question carefully, her eyes drifting briefly toward the window before returning to him. I think, she said slowly, when someone is frightened, what they need most is not more information or more explanation. They need someone steady enough to hold on to for just a little while, until they can find their own footing again. I learned a long time ago that calm is something you can offer someone else, even when you do not fully feel it yourself. Jake nodded slowly, her words settling into something deeper than simple gratitude. That is a rare gift, he said, whatever cost you paid to learn it. Elena's throat tightened slightly, though she managed a small, honest smile. Some costs are worth carrying, she said, if it means someone else gets to walk away whole. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet hum of hospital machines the only sound in the room. Eventually, Jake broke the silence again, his tone lighter now. "So," he said, "does this mean you are going back to it? Surgery, I mean. Real surgery." Elena hesitated, the question landing somewhere she had not yet fully allowed herself to explore. "I do not know yet," she admitted honestly. "I came here because I thought I needed something quieter, something smaller." "And now?" Jake asked gently. Elena glanced toward the door, toward the hallway that led back to the trauma bay, back to Grace's office, back to Daniel, and the quiet weight of a past she had spent so long trying to leave behind. "Now," she said softly, "I am not so sure quiet was ever really what I needed." Jake smiled, a genuine warmth spreading across his tired face. "For what it is worth," he said, "I think this town got very lucky the day you walked through those doors." Elena reached out and gently squeezed his hand, the simple gesture carrying more gratitude than words could easily hold. "And I think I got lucky too," she said. "You reminded me of something I had almost convinced myself to forget." "What is that?" "That helping someone through their worst moment is not just something I used to do," she said quietly. "It is who I am, no matter how quiet a life I try to build around it." Jake's smile widened, though exhaustion was beginning to pull gently at his eyes again. "Sounds like you already have your answer then." Elena sat with him a while longer, until his breathing steadied into the slow, even rhythm of much-needed rest. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb him, and made her way back into the hallway, her mind turning over everything the day had brought into the open. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the weight on her shoulders felt just slightly lighter. 2 weeks passed at Fairbridge General, and life inside the hospital slowly settled back into its usual rhythm, though nothing about the quiet new nurse felt quite the same as before. Word of what she had done for Jake had spread far beyond hospital walls, reaching the small community around them, though Elena remained as modest about the story as she had been from her very first day. Jake recovered steadily, his color returning, his strength building a little more with each passing day. Claire visited him often, relieved beyond words that the routine appointment which had turned into a crisis had ended in recovery rather than tragedy. On the day of his discharge, he insisted on stopping by the nurse's station before leaving, determined to say goodbye properly to the woman who had guided him through the most frightening hours of his life. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said, standing steadier now than he had in weeks, a small bag of belongings slung over his uninjured shoulder. "You owe me nothing," Elena said warmly. "Just take care of yourself. Follow up with your doctors. Do not wait until something tears again before you ask for help next time." Jake laughed softly. "Lesson learned," he said. "Old habits, though. We do not always ask for help until we absolutely have to." "I understand that better than you might think," Elena said quietly. Jake studied her for a long moment, his voice gentler now. "Whatever you decide to do next," he said, "about surgery, about everything you told me that day, I hope you choose the path that feels most like you. This town is lucky to have had you, even for a short while. But something tells me you were always meant for bigger rooms than this one." Elena smiled, the words settling deeply, echoing something she had been quietly wrestling with ever since the truth of her past had come into the open. "Thank you, Jake," she said, "for trusting me that first day, and for reminding me of something I needed to remember." They said their goodbyes, and Elena watched from the hospital entrance as Claire helped Jake into her car, both of them smiling, despite everything they had been through together in the past 2 weeks. Later that afternoon, Elena found herself once again sitting across from Grace in her office, though this time the conversation carried none of the tension from their first serious talk. Daniel sat nearby as well, having made a habit of checking in on Elena regularly since their reunion, the easy friendship between them slowly rebuilding itself with each passing conversation. "I have been thinking," Elena began, her hands folded calmly in her lap, "about everything that happened these past 2 weeks. Grace leaned back in her chair, her expression open and encouraging. "I imagined you might be. I came here because I believed a quiet life was what I needed," Elena continued. "I thought stepping away from surgery entirely was the only way to carry what happened to me. But watching Jake recover, knowing that what I once considered a burden actually saved his life, it made me realize something I had been avoiding for a long time." "And what is that?" Daniel asked gently. That running from what I am good at was never really healing, Elena said. It was hiding. There is a difference. Grace nodded slowly, clearly having anticipated where the conversation was heading. So what would you like to do? Elena took a steady breath, the same kind of breath she had once used to calm frightened patients in far more dangerous places than this quiet office. I would like to transfer into the trauma department, she said, not as a nurse standing on the edges of surgery, but as a surgeon, fully, the way I was trained to be, if Fairbridge General is willing to have me. Daniel broke into a wide, genuine smile, the kind that had been missing from his face since the day Elena had first disappeared from their old unit years earlier. I was hoping you would say that, he said. Honestly, I have been waiting for you to say it since the moment I saw you working over Jake. Grace considered the request for a long moment, though her expression made it clear she had already made up her mind. Your file may have some unusual gaps, she said, but nothing in it, or in what I have witnessed with my own eyes these past 2 weeks, suggests you are anything less than exactly what this hospital needs. I would be glad to help you make that transition. Relief and quiet excitement mixed together in Elena's chest, an unfamiliar but welcome feeling after so many months of careful, guarded living. Thank you, she said softly. Both of you. Over the following weeks, Elena worked closely with the hospital administration and the trauma department to formalize her transfer, her credentials quickly verified and approved given her extensive background, once she was finally ready to share it fully. Owen, delighted to have someone of her caliber joining the team permanently, made it a point to personally welcome her into the trauma unit on her first official day in her new role. Ready for this? He asked, a knowing smile on his face as she pulled on a fresh set of scrubs marked with the trauma department's insignia. More ready than I have felt in a long time, Elena replied. Nora, who had grown close to Elena over the past several weeks, stopped by to wish her well before her first official shift as a surgeon. I always knew there was more to you than met the eye, she said, smiling warmly. I am glad the rest of us finally got to see it. I could not have found my way back without people like you, Elena said. Thank you for making this place feel safe enough to be honest. Ethan, still amazed by everything he had witnessed since Elena's arrival, made his way over as well, his earlier nervousness long since replaced with genuine admiration. I have learned more from watching you these past few weeks than I did in most of my training, he admitted. I hope I get the chance to work alongside you again soon. You will, Elena promised. Trauma cases do not exactly wait politely for convenient timing. As her first shift in the trauma department began, Elena felt something settle deeply within her, a sense of alignment that had been missing for far too long. She had spent months trying to convince herself that a smaller, quieter role was enough to make peace with her past. But peace, she had come to understand, was not found in running from who she truly was. It was found in accepting it fully, scars and all, and choosing to keep helping people anyway. Later that evening, as she finished reviewing patient files in the trauma department's quiet office, Daniel stopped by, leaning casually against the doorway. How does it feel? He asked. Being back where you belong? Elena considered the question carefully, a small, genuine smile spreading across her face. It feels like coming home, she said. Not the home I thought I needed to leave behind, but the one I finally understand I never truly lost. Daniel smiled warmly, stepping further into the room. For what it is worth, he said, the team missed you more than you probably ever realized. I missed all of you too, Elena admitted. More than I let myself feel, until recently. Outside the office window, the hospital continued its usual quiet rhythm, ordinary in every visible way, yet carrying within it now a woman who had finally stopped hiding from the very gift that had once defined her. Elena Voss, once simply known as the calm new nurse who seemed a little too skilled for her job title, had fully stepped back into the role she was always meant to hold. And somewhere across town, Jake Reyes continued his recovery, grateful every single day for the ordinary follow-up appointment that had, against every expectation, led him straight into the hands of the very surgeon who would end up saving not just his life, but perhaps her own sense of purpose as well. It was, in the end, a story neither of them had expected. A quiet hospital, an ordinary day, a collapse nobody saw coming, and a nurse who turned out to be exactly the person everyone needed, long before anyone knew her name.